Welcome to Cubit, probably a silent Cubit not many of you have seen before. We originally intended to hold this event in the gallery, but bookings very quickly grew so large we had to think about alternative spaces. And I'm glad that we chose to keep it at Cubit because, and the fact that you had to come through the studios, because it's very much a site of production. And the education programme we run here is very much about opening up that space for production to different kinds of participants. This event today is very much not a Cubit event, it's very much Sarah's event, a QR event, and she's done an amazing job for a very recent graduate to produce 2 books already and to build this kind of way of looking at arts education, this way of examining exactly what it is art education is about. It's fantastic. So I'm really, really pleased that this event is kind of the centrepiece of the Festival of Blackboards, which is our programme of events exploring arts education. You should find on your seats a QR flyer and a programme for the Festival of Blackboards. And we've already had one excellent event on teaching art in schools. We've got 3 more coming up, an exhibition opening, one on Wednesday, exploring the creative industries in relation to arts education, and one next Saturday exploring kind of how fine art practice is a form of knowledge making through process. Couple of quick technical points. Toilets are back through that way. There are signs. It's basically the first right-hand turning and follow it. First left-hand turning, follow it round. Fire exit is over here, and in the event of a fire, we'll just open those doors anyway. So exit through this way. I'll leave it there and hand over to Sarah for this afternoon's excellent event. But thank you very much for coming.
Cool. Thank you, Daniel. Can everyone hear? Okay. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today, and I also wanted to thank LCase quickly and Evelyn Wilson for supporting today's event. So just to give a quick introduction, as Daniel said, I run an art organisation called Q Art London, and it's open to students and graduates from across London. It's also open to self-trained artists and anyone at all with an interest in art. From the yellow leaflet that you've all got on your chairs, you can see that the main activity is that QR opens up the art school crit, which is the main form of art education used in UK art schools, and exports that around different art colleges and public gallery spaces for anyone to present in. We also run gallery visits, host panel discussions like this one, and everyone who presents in one of our crits gets to participate in our end-of-year exhibition. So the main aim of the publications, as well as Q Art's entire programme, is basically to demystify some of the systems that make up the contemporary art world, such as the art market and high-level art education, both for those people already involved in those systems and for those people outside. So the book that's launching today, 11 Course Leaders, 20 Questions, and by extension today's discussion, came from a desire I had as a student, term recent graduate, to get an understanding of undergraduate art education system, its histories, and how it feeds the kind of contemporary art that we see now. I think one of the problems that I was going to mention of being a student without the hindsight that I now have as a result of doing this book is that the art education that students can find themselves in can seem unconditioned or neutral, and not the economically and philosophically and all of those like generationally contingent things that it is, and that the interviews of the course leaders have revealed it to be. That most courses don't teach art history, teach craft-based skills only on a need-to-know basis, if at all, and advocate self-directed study can at first be confusing. This especially so when these might be all of the things that those on the outside or those growing up and thinking about continued study into high-level art education might expect it to offer. So I wondered how art education has evolved, how it became what it is today, what its current philosophies are, and where in contemporary art education the education takes place. As I was entering the third year of my fine art degree at Goldsmiths, with all of the questions going around in my head, I became aware of a proliferation of conversation and debate, which was largely catalysed in the pages of Art Monthly, about an apparent crisis in art education. I was curious as to whether these pages would shed any light on some of the questions that I was thinking through, or if they would anyway account for the number of students that you would see in the studios talking themselves out of producing certain types of work, thinking too hard to make other types of work, or making work in some cases, and I'm quoting this, that at least looks like contemporary art. Some university art departments were also reported as having low student satisfaction levels, which was indicated by the National Student Survey results. And artists educated in the previous generation tended to say that these were symptomatic of a fear of risk-taking and a culture of expectancy amongst current students. This was caused, according to them, by the increasingly academic and bureaucratic nature of the subject that came about when art schools became a part of universities around 1992, which was something that they had to do in order to survive. So, intrigued by all of these suggestions and holding all of the questions I've had and more besides, I asked the 11 course leaders if they would mind if I tapped into their knowledge and experience on this area. They said yes, hence the book. And I just asked them instinctive questions really about the history of art education, their own art education, how they evaluate art, their course philosophies, access, selection, the importance of an institution's reputation. And I also asked them for their take on the suggestions made in Art Monthly. Today I'm going to re-ask some of those questions, as well as a couple of new ones, and use this as a unique opportunity to do the two things that the book can't, which is to encourage debate between the course leaders and also give you the chance to feed in your questions and opinions as well. So I thought I'll introduce the panellists now. So to the left we've got Mo Throp, Fine Art Course Leader at Chelsea. Martin Newth, BA Photography Course Leader and Fine Art Course Leader at Camberwell. John Timberlake, Course Leader at Middlesex. Stephen Carter, was it XD Pathway Leader at Byam Shaw and former co-director at Byam Shaw.
Central St Martin's.
And Central St Martin's, sorry. Jane Lee, BA Fine Art Course Director at Central St Martin's. Louis Nixon, Fine Art Course Leader at Kingston. Rosemarie McGoldrick, Fine Art Course Leader at Cass. John Aiken, Professor and Director of the Slade. And Andrew Bannister, Fine Art Course Director at City and Guilds. I'd also like to thank Michael Archer and Dereck Harris, both of who can't be here today. Michael is Course Leader at Goldsmiths and Dereck is Course Leader at Wimbledon. Both of them are on holiday. And I'd also like to thank Patricia Bickers, who's at the back over there, for writing the introduction to the book. Okay, so on to today, just to let you know what's going on. It's going to be divided into four broad topics. The first will look broadly at the changes that have occurred in art education since those on the panel studied at art school. The second will look at the types and philosophies of courses that the different course leaders run. The third will ask whether or not art can be taught and where in the subject the education takes place. And the fourth will seek their opinions on alternative art schools, the impact of rising tuition fees, and get their predictions on what's next for art education. We have about 20 minutes roughly for each of the topics. After each topic, we're going to take 2 questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question at that time, I just ask that you can make it relevant to the topic and be very, very concise, because we've got a limited amount of time to get through quite a lot. And on to the first question. So, as I indicated, many people who went to art school prior to 1992, when they were still independent and before they became a part of universities, suggest that a lot has changed for the worse. The argument goes that the once individual, semi-vocational, even radical art school where artists taught and where those that attended did so because they were answering some sort of calling, to make art have become over-academicised, fee-charging and degree or even PhD awarding institutions. This that have fostered a culture of expectancy or complacency amongst an increasing number of students who people observe no longer go to art school merely to answer such a calling. Staff are now preferred to have a teaching qualification. Research, dissertations and assessments are standard components, and art departments in many universities are having to fight their corner for the right to studio space. So what I wanted to begin by asking them, because many of you studied for your own art education before this transition, is what do you think about these arguments? Has the transition been only negative, or have some of the developments been positive as well? Have students' motivations for studying changed? And finally, is there a crisis in art education at the moment, or is this angst just part of the nature of art education? And I'd like to ask John Aiken to start us off on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's about 3 days discussion. And it's probably been discussed for the last 30 years. Well, I suppose of a generation that entered art school shortly after a major period of change in the 60s. So I came to art school in 1968, and I entered it at a point where art school education was all over the newspapers and in the television, and that was the revolt at Hornsey School of Art and Guildford to a lesser extent in certain other places. So it was a period of looking at how a major change had occurred in the early 60s because of the Coldstream Report and the setting up of the DIP-AD. But that was very quickly identified as having a lot of serious problems. And this debate about where complementary studies, where art history met, studio practice was one of those, and there was a lot of difficulties and a lot of a meeting of the old system and the new. So the old system was a lot of I wouldn't like to describe it as a rump, but certainly because I benefited from it enormously, but there was the older generation of tutors who had a very particular training and wanted to train the students in how to do things and how to do things well. And then did a new group of young artists coming in that wanted to kick over the traces and change all that, including the students coming. So there was a kind of bit of a cultural battle going on, but at the same time that was very productive for the canny student because we get the best of both worlds if you used it well. And I came from not a very canny background in Northern Ireland, but I did learn at Chelsea how to be fairly canny and negotiate my way through that particularly peculiar activity of being an art student at the end of the 60s. I think over the course of the 5 years I was a student, and then consequently I went to Rome for 2 years and came back in 1975. It had already changed enormously. I think the DIP-AD had changed to a BA, MAs were coming in, and the whole structure and mechanism of how the courses were delivered was becoming much more procedural. I think it was very relaxed when I was a student at that time. Procedure, in my view, and I say this because I just gave a talk at Venice, which was entitled Undermining Orthodoxies. And I think what has happened is that in a lot of institutions, and I don't mean the core staff teaching or the students in the institutions, but the bigger institution is emphasizing, in my view, procedure over subject. So the subject and the discipline should be leading how an art school functions. But I think increasingly its procedures are running how an art school functions. And certainly throughout my career I've tried to resist that and resisted it fairly successfully at the Slade over the last 30 years and certainly over the last 10 years. But we've always been part of a university, and that makes a big difference. So the Slade is actually something which is within the remit of University College. It wants the Slade to be there. It encourages the Slade, supports the Slade, and gives us the kind of resources which we think we need in order to promote the subject to best practice. And that's quite crucial, I think, because I remember one of the provosts said to me, I was rather alarmed because they were asking us to do something, which I didn't agree with. And he said, well, John, you're the expert in this subject. You have to tell us what we're supposed to do. This is what the university wants to do. If that doesn't suit the Slade, then you don't do it, which I think is quite rare, if not actually would be perceived as being slightly outrageous in a lot of the universities that want the art school to conform to their way of doing things, which actually, as far as the subject is concerned, is generally not the best way to do things for an art school. I think one of the other aspects is that, which I was talking about in Venice, was that my generation came into art school, I think, to undermine orthodoxies, the orthodoxy of how art was taught. But I think over the last 40 years, the institutionalization of the art schools has served to be undermined by the orthodoxies rather than undermining the orthodoxies. So there's a kind of shift has occurred, which I think is very dangerous. It doesn't have to be fatal, but it is dangerous. And I think in the European context, this is quite interesting because they've gone through the kind of changes that went on in the British art schools in the 60s, they've been doing in the last 10 years. And I think they're actually not learning from the mistakes that the British art school system made over the last 40 years and starting to produce courses and institutions which I think are looking very good for the future. And one of them is this one, the Iuva in Venice, run by Angela Vettese, and it was she that set up this conference that coincided with the Venice Biennale. And in that, they asked what an art school should be. And some of these things might be quite familiar to you, but they asked the teachers, I'll just read out a few of them. They asked the academics what they thought an art school should be. And if I can find them now. I've marked them all, but I seem to have marked the wrong places. Typical. Okay, well the one I think, in a way, is saying something which I agree with, and this is by Francesco Bonami, the curator. One of the things which they're doing in Venice is they're linking up all the aspects of the University of Venice, all the aspects of the art school, including curating, philosophy, design, fine art, working together as a collective activity. So the whole notion of multidisciplinarity is across the university and within the art school. But Francesco says, and I quote, "An art school is where you learn what not to do and where we are taught the best way to fail. Art is failure, and if an art school doesn't teach this, then it has failed." And I think I agree with that philosophically, because I think all too often now we're being driven by what you have to do to get a degree and not the kind of quality of the work you make in the process of getting to a degree.
Does anyone else want to come in there at all?
I'd like to come in on a couple of things. I mean, first of all, with the European universities, the European Art School development, there are two very rich industrialists who put their money into that project.
They've just had a lot of the funding taken away. There is a movement across Europe to rethink the art school, of course. I mean, partly to do with the 10 years of the Bologna process and the Lisbon strategy that makes it impossible for you to avoid it. I think that the development of those specialist schools where one rethinks everything, and I mean, although I would suggest that many of those things are already in our art schools in London and certainly are preserved by the staff all the time. I think that what you've just described is being reproduced in many countries in Europe. They are improving great art schools. But that has to be seen against the background of the fact that 42 art schools in France closed last year and the students were thrown out. That, the decision to make half a dozen specialist art schools where they could have exactly what they wanted meant that anyone living in
the area of Perpignan, who had normally gone to Perpignan Art School, was thrown out and then went to Bordeaux, and then there wasn't enough place in Bordeaux, and their art school came to an abrupt end, their art school education. So there are other crises behind this. It's not that we're doing it all wrong and in Europe it's really good. It's not like that at all. The reason the art schools in France have closed down is because they were all supported municipally.
Well, I think the other reason is there's many less art students in Europe than there are in Britain, proportionally. So you can fund totally institutions in a way which you simply
And
can't
in
fund
most
here.
countries in Europe, particularly in Italy and in Germany and in France, you can choose to do fine art at a university or at an art school. The minority, the very, very small minority, get to go to an art school. And the others go to very poor courses in universities.
As you've brought up numbers of students, that's one of the things that was a lot talked about, that there are so many students coming onto courses nowadays. And I thought, what do you think of that? I thought I might ask Martin that question.
So I think it's often one of the things that you hear about being entirely detrimental about art schools is there's such a growing amount of numbers, and it does pose certain difficulties and problems in delivery. But I'm absolutely, completely of the opinion that it's a really good thing to have more people come to art schools. And I've been running a growing course, which has grown a few more every year. And what's really noticeable is that you get more good students, you get more really engaged students, and I think that's a really great thing. And the kind of discussions you can have can really expand, and the sorts of things that you can get the students to actually do very actively kind of expand. It clearly has an impact on a studio space. That's really the only downside from my point of view, is that you have to be incredibly inventive about how students think about their working environment. That's not such a bad thing either, to be inventive about anything. And it clearly has an impact on the way that you deliver. And it comes up in your book a few times. It's about doing teacher training courses and that kind of thing. And they can help you think about how you deliver to large numbers. I totally agree with everything that John just said. And I had a Slade education myself, and it was fantastic, absolutely amazing. But you have a very small number of students there. So it makes it an entirely different kind of proposition. And in a sense, it is very privileged. The Slade is in a very privileged position in what you just explained, in having that kind of support from an institution. But I think there's a kind of there's a requirement now for art schools to be a bit sharper than they have been in the past about thinking exactly about their kind of broader social function and how we deliver and how we are more inclusive and don't lose any of those fantastically good things that John's kind of suggesting about art schools, but really make them kind of inclusive and interesting places. Does that answer that?
Yeah. The other thing I was going to ask John, actually, as you mentioned the teaching qualification, there was a lot of debate about whether art teachers now should or should not have one, and can I ask you for your view on that? Or anything else that's just been talked about?
Well, I actually, before I made that point, I think, I graduated in 1990, and it picks up on some things that Martin says, really, and also that John said. I think that there has been a huge growth in not only the number of people who want to be artists, which is a great thing, as Martin says, but also the management and the mediation of art, and effectively the sort of instrumentalisation of art over the past 20 years, both in terms of, say, government policy. The Blair government famously used art effectively as a social inclusion factor or instrument, technique, apparatus, shall we say. Lots of artists were employed in schemes and projects where it effectively fulfilled an agenda which would otherwise have required a lot more investment from that government in infrastructure and other forms of social work, public works. So art was seen as a model of, Andrew Ross is really the best person to look at in terms of his book No Colour, and the way he talks about how artists often provide inadvertently a model of hyper-exploitation within the economy generally. And the other side of instrumentalisation is obviously things like the growth of Biennale culture as a kind of cultural race as opposed to an arms race, really, between countries. So there's been this sort of vast increase in neoliberal culture towards the instrumentalisation of art. The other thing I think is that this does come down to the ability to cognitively be aware of that as a teacher, and to think. Teaching is not instinctive. Teaching is something that is learned. So in terms of making wannabe artists, if you like, students aware of the world they're entering and these factors, you not only have to be able to relay that, which to some extent comes with language perhaps and awareness of the world, but you also need to be able to manage that in a classroom situation in the way that Martin's saying. I mean, I think just one other point, I don't want to hog the mic in any way, but there's two aspects which I'd sort of want to just flag up. One is the issue of bureaucratisation, which I've mentioned in terms of the aspect of the mediation and instrumentalisation of art, and effectively its teaching. The other thing is this issue of crises. I think there's two kinds of crises that we talk about. I think it's necessary to separate the two out. In one sense, there is always going to be organic crises within art. Every generation of artists effectively co-ops, negates, synthesises the ideas, the forms, the methods of practice that the teaching generation give it. And I think that's just a process of convulsive crisis, if you like. That's an organic crisis within art, and I think that's about its development. And I don't think that's something to be in any way frightened of or worried about. There's then the kind of inorganic crises, in a sense the attacks that have happened on art, which are partly due to the fact that the mediation of art and its instrumentalisation has given rise to an increasing amount of bureaucratisation. And bureaucracy comes at a price. It comes at a price in terms of both its economic cost, and it comes also in terms of cultural price. In terms of it is the toll, if you like, exacted by the norm on the extraordinary. The toll that is exacted by the average on the unusual or the excellent. Now, that's not to argue that we can do without bureaucracy. It's not to argue that, I'm not arguing for whole-scale privatisation, but I do think that inevitably, given the shift in government policy, the expansion of the last 20 years is going to have, it's going to be a backlash to that. And that's what we're seeing now. Mm-hmm. And those attacks, that crisis, which as I say, I characterise as an inorganic crisis within the art world, effectively it has to be linked to the other attacks on the public sector generally. So I think it's just important to sort of perhaps differentiate the two. One crisis I think is a good thing, the other crisis I think is a bad thing. And you can't talk about the inorganic crisis without talking about the general attacks on the public sector, the cuts, the fees issue, etc., etc. The two are not the same.
Can I just ask you, do you think that the almost hysterical rise of an audit culture in the government, from the Thatcher years on, because it's not really I don't think it's the beginning of 1992 and think people going into universities that caused this. It's a sort of manic, lack of trust of anyone who is not absolutely like the Prime Minister herself, who isn't the Prime Minister herself, cannot be allowed any kind of trust. And so there was a paranoid audit culture went across the country, and within all universities and art schools, not just art schools are precisely like the universities in this, everything had to be weighed and measured, and for every audit that came from the government, so the art school and the universities had to build an administrative culture within themselves to answer that. And as usual, the institution, which wanted to be quite different, mimicked the form of the capitalist structure, which was the structure in which it was existing. And so now that we can't afford, the government itself, the country itself finds it can't afford that audit culture and is divesting itself of that. Do you not find that the art schools are beginning to strip away some of that bureaucracy?
I think they do, but bureaucracy, I totally agree with your description. I think the key thing there, if I can answer, by the way, Sarah, actually, I jumped in there, is the fact that bureaucracy obviously will perpetuate itself. And I think there's the one thing, I'll make it a brief point, but I think, and this isn't to portray some people as saints and some people as sinners or goodies and baddies, but it is to say that inevitably there is a layer as that bureaucracy has developed, or bureaucracy has developed, there is always going to be a layer of people, good-hearted, well-intentioned, whatever, who nevertheless give up on their intellectual or creative ambition in order to pursue a managerial career. And at some point, that exacts, as I say, a cultural price or a cost on those who've continued. Their choices, their career choices that people make. I mean, effectively, if we find suddenly that, you know, the line manager is being very dog in a manger about research leave, or is, you know, wanting to hold back on people getting certain opportunities, it may be because, to a certain extent, resentments or pragmatics that they have been had to face with are taking their toll on the way they deal with other people. And I think that's why I say bureaucracy exerts a cultural price. It becomes what the norm expects of the extraordinary.
I think I'm talking at a different level of bureaucracy. I'm talking about the unproductive superstructure at the associate dean level. I mean, or not necessarily associate dean, or dean level. Which I must say, you know, our own rector is it comes from a different political cast of mind, and we have seen levels of bureaucratic audit stripped out of our university, out of Central St Martin's over the last 3 years at a breathtaking rate. And I just, which of course I applaud, because it helps one to see more funds coming down to face the student. But I wondered if it was spreading, if it were in fact local to us, or whether it's something which is happening nationally.
I think it's nuanced between different institutions, but I think the general trend develops because of the expansion. And I mean, it's as I say, I'm dealing here with general characterisations. I'm trying to sort of put a quick, you know, on the hoof kind of description around something. And I don't think that there's necessarily that much to differentiate between what I'm saying and what you're saying. But
yes, yeah, you know. I think we're in a particularly critical position at the moment, our institution, because of the move, etc.
I mean,
so it's probably think some of our changes are quite near the surface.
I don't want to see. You know, ultimately, I don't want to see people losing their jobs, whether they're administrative people or whether they're teachers. I don't want to see students not getting the opportunities. I think this is about the fact that there is certain trends develop at certain times that in one sense have been unmanaged, that have created problems. You know, there's been this kind of exponential growth, and certain things happen if they're not planned. But I do think that, you know, that is a crisis in some senses which is separate to the organic crisis as I described it in terms of life.
Very interesting hearing all that, and I think parallel to that is a big shift in the way the subject has been delivered to the students, and this sort of breakdown. You know, when I was a student, it was painting, sculpture, printmaking, photography, and now these. I mean, it was interesting looking at the book. That all of us here sort of echoed this big shift away from individual disciplines into a much more broad-based delivery of our subject. And I think alongside that, there was also the introduction in many institutions of modular schemes of delivery, and this whole kind of accountability that didn't exist when I was a student was also added to this increasing bureaucratic burden within art schools.
It's the same thing. I mean, the unitisation has to do with the QA, which has to do with the audit that was set up by Thatcher. I think it's up to each art school how they deal with the concept of discipline. But I think discipline is still highly effective and very problematic within all the art schools in London. I mean, the way we deal with it, of course, is to have 4 different pathways, so that the discipline remains an irritant in a sense, the idea of the discipline. So that, you know, and to explain to the students right from the beginning what we mean by discipline and interdisciplinarity, and you know, the idea that the history of practice is live within what they're doing. You know, that in a sense is something that art school education still, I think. I don't think any of us would say that we don't carry that along.
Well, I think when I was a student, you know, I never questioned my teaching staff someone who's sitting here next to me as to how I was doing on the course, you know, what my progress was, and these are all things now that as educators or people working with art schools, we're asked these questions all the time, and this level of accountability, I think is a major shift in art education.
Well, we're getting different students as well, because they're educated to ask questions. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say on that. I was just. Oh, okay.
I just wanted to come back on the discipline thing, because unlike most of the people here, we made a very specific decision to have disciplines, these retained disciplines in painting, sculpture, drawing, photography. And our position is very kind of clear about that, is that if you're going to have cross-disciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, then you kind of need disciplines first. And so actually, when you're entering university or art college as an 18-year-old or as a mature student for the first time, getting told you can do anything you want in the world, it's fine art, it's kind of a huge prospect, and we thought kind of over-daunting. What offering disciplines isn't about, though, is about tradition and trying to get everyone to be in camps. It's actually about offering the possibility to, you know, kick against something, react to that, and develop disciplines. Then just the other point I'll come back on is the modularisation is a bad thing. Actually, my view is that units or modularisation is actually what's going to save the future of art schools, actually, because if you've got to pay £9,000 a year, it is the only way that you can perhaps do a bit of it for £3,000 and then come back after you've earned a bit of money and pick that up. That's exactly what's going to be, might allow people from working class backgrounds with unprivileged positions to be able to engage with art school education. So I totally agree with the problems and the bureaucratisation as being issues, but it's funny how some of those things are actually going to properly save us in a way, or save art schools.
Can you explain that bit a bit more? You said about being able to pick up a certain bit and then...
Well, okay, if you think about your course as a complete, total thing, which is progression from the minute you enter, and you slowly develop on this smooth trajectory up until your degree show, where you become this fully fledged artist, this sort of old model, then you have to pay £9,000 times 3 and do it all in one go. If you're not able to pay that money over and over again, then you might say, okay, I'm going to do this particular unit, or whatever it might be, exhibiting, whatever that unit is, and I'm going to pay the money for that unit, plug in, and then you might go and do the next unit at Falmouth, or if that's what you have to go to get a job, or whatever it might be. And I think that's kind of interesting.
Can I just add two things to that? One is that I mean, my first degree was done like that because I'm from Canada, and in Canada they built their universities in the 60s, and all of them were built modularised because, you know, you had to like dredge the Great Lakes in between the 3 months you were doing or bring the corn in. And it's always amazed me that there's a horror goes around the room that, you know, when we move away from the Oxford-Cambridge model in Great Britain because of that. But the other thing is that it's been extremely difficult and costly to run part-time modes or part-time art school undergraduate degrees because we've always run them as separate degrees. What I think is a better model is to simply allow design your degree so that the students can at any moment, in the moment of financial hardship, can go from a full-time position to a part-time position without it affecting anything, and particularly the morale.
As some of you some of you were touching on the different types of courses you're running, and that how there's this kind of a split between broad-based courses and courses that are divided by subject pathway. And Martin, you've already given your views on why you run yours divided by like drawing and sculpture. And I was wondering, actually, Mo, if you could give some reasons for why you have a broad fine art course.
Yes, well, when I took over as course director at Chelsea, which was 6 years ago now, the course was divided into 3 pathways, which had a very negative relationship to each other. This may be specific to Chelsea. I don't know if it's inevitable that they're all so competitive and hierarchical between them, and the staff start to hate. Anyway, it was, I tell you, at Chelsea, not a nice situation there. Anyway, that's one aspect of it. But I thought that, and the inflexibility of Chelsea at that time as well, to allow a student to think of their work outside the material, the medium that they use. Now, I thought that, in a way, to approach making primarily through a medium is a very outdated approach to making fine art practice. That in the first place. I know this thinking, making, actually, of course, goes on together. But to talk about it in terms of boundaries from the medium rather than ways of thinking seemed to me very limiting. That the student has to get over that right from the beginning. For instance, students coming from A-level or from foundation, when they introduce themselves, even though we try not to get them to introduce themselves in the way of, yes, I'm a painter, I'm a whatever, I'm a what. So I think we have to undo what students think fine art practice is. And just to define themselves in the term of the particular medium that they're using at that moment, and they're going to think like that for 3 years, actually, I don't think gives very enabling boundaries to think against. I absolutely think it is not enabling to think about thinking against boundaries. I think there was a fluidity that students need to think about work, and I do say, because there is a kind of a thinking about Chelsea then as not having pathways or whatever. When students do come to open days, I'm very careful to say, just because you think you're a painter now, don't think you have to go on a painting course and you only get to come to Chelsea because you've got a wishy-washy way of thinking. It's not so. If you're going to be painting and you want to see yourself as a painter, you will be encouraged to do that if it's appropriate. So it's a way of getting them to unthink through something that our secondary education, I think, really about ways of doing, rather than opening up to thinking, or when you're with the student thinking, they're painting away and whatever, and then starting to think about their course. Because first of all, sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit. I would never believe that you're just, touched by God, that I just make it, I don't know what I'm doing. We know we all do that as well. But that, I'm speechless in front of my work, I just do it. That is the main job that we're all dealing with. So how do we approach that? And it's very easy to slip in, well, I'm using paint, how are we using paint? And my old joke about move the pink along a bit, dear. It's not an answer, it's not. It's to think the approach that the student would be to get them to think for themselves about why is this medium then maybe appropriate to what I'm trying to do, even if it's thinking about painting and the history of painting, and they need to know the history of the stuff that they're engaging with. So I think that that really needs to be knocked on the head. That's why I'm very much for this more open approach to thinking, not through the medium primarily. Nevertheless, we have painting groups, we have lots of workshops. Not to forget the importance of workshops where run by technicians who are particular to the stuff. And that's a very important thing. It doesn't mean to say that in the studio we don't actually talk about making. Making is actually very important, and it's not been removed from the agenda, from the programme about making work. We have we all do have fantastic technicians, and technicians as teachers and demonstrators, and a very different level of engagement. A different engagement with students is a very, very, very important part of that process of learning through their material, through the actual making as well.
I was going to come back to the making element of that in a minute, but I just know that both Rosemarie and John, and then John afterwards, perhaps.
I was just going to agree entirely with
and Andrew.
I just agree entirely with Mo. It's very similar to what we're trying to do at the CAS. Also, about specialising as soon as you come into a college, just thinking about the very nature of the CAS, which has a very broad cohort of students from very working class, different ethnic groups attending. So lots of these students aren't coming from very sophisticated schooling or backgrounds. They've saved up a long time to come into college. So they're coming back with families or having worked for a long time. And lots of these students who arrive at the CAS have just think about fine art being painting. So the idea of just saying, okay, be a painter, means that actually you might be denying that student from being a really successful filmmaker. So opening up these different ways of making and thinking is essential, I think, for the students, particularly at the CAS. And it's quite true, Mo said, that at the CAS we have lots of now new HPL painters coming in who are definitely teachers, practitioners, so they're outside working internationally and nationally, showing students about the language of painting. Likewise with new sculptors coming in who are teacher and practitioners essentially, which is really important that we have both working together to do that. And sort of, so it's open and the studios are open. So painters will be talking with sculptors and sort of, or more inclined that way. And then sort of leaving maybe that specialisation, which they will be doing. Quite right what Mo was saying, if people want to do installation, they'll be doing it. If people want to do, or students want to do painting, they'll be doing it. And it may be that it specialises much later on, they find out what you want to do. You know, you might want to be filmmakers, performance artists, so it's very important to keep that door wide open, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we've always run a fine art course. It's the BA and the MA in fine art, but we also have subject areas, and I think the subject areas are very, very important, in fact crucially important, but they're not technique or materially led, and they haven't been for 40, 50 years, I would have said. I mean, maybe people spend 5 years or 4 years painting, but they wouldn't say they were in the school in order to work from that discipline in itself, the materiality of that discipline. I think the key is, for me, that where there's sculpture schools or painting schools within institutions, that's very dangerous. And I think that's proved to be very dangerous in a number of institutions that I've had to go and validate over the years. But I think what's crucial is that the students themselves and the staff are working across the disciplines. And within those subject areas, I mean, if somebody's in the subject area of sculpture, it doesn't mean they have to make sculpture. They're working from within a discourse which is around sculpture. And, you know, sculpture in the expanded field has been blown wide open since the 60s. So it's not discipline related in the sense of traditional ways of doing things.
I think so.
Tutorials should be across the subject areas. Staff should be working across the subject areas, and students should be and are discussing it, because one doesn't define what an artist does by a certain studio discipline. It just doesn't exist anymore. It's so wide open. Somebody could be utilising 10 different techniques in terms of producing a work of art. They could be putting together new technologies with analog technologies and art. I mean, the students are working in an incredibly dynamic way and a really interesting way. And you know, if art schools are in crisis, which I think in some respect they are, it doesn't seem to be translating into what the students are doing, because in my view, the work that students are producing over the last 5 years has been better than it's ever been.
I agree with you, yeah.
And it's been more meaningful than it's ever been, and they're working in a much wider context than they ever have been.
And sort of, it seems far more political as well. And young students.
But I think one of the reasons for that is because we don't any longer consider disciplines to be simply material.
Exactly.
I mean, you're conflating discipline and materiality here, which is not the same thing. We have pathways, the three-dimensional pathway, for instance, with us, distinguishes itself by the kind of questions it asks about space and monumentality, not any material.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think this just hasn't existed except in very few places for decades. And where it does exist, it's causing a lot of problems.
Can I just bring in?
I mean, I think it seems to me that a lot of these questions about the appropriateness or inappropriateness of subject discipline specialism seem to relate very much to the kind of character of the institution where they're taking place, really, and the sort of situation that may exist with, as you described it, where you've got schools or rivalries between different departments. I mean,
you're always going to have that.
Sure, of course. Yes, it's innate, but
you need not.
No, every art's going to be in those rivalries.
But I think that in a way, for me, the argument, in a sense, about retaining some sort of notion of subject specialism, can only really take place if there's a degree of permeability between those different disciplines. When they become fiefdoms, that's a whole different problem. You know, in a way, I would hope that, you know, in terms of, manage a kind of sculpture pathway within the Fine Art course, is that the kind of tutorial discourse which takes place between staff and students should allow for, or if not, and encourage, if appropriate, that a student investigates different models of thinking or different material processes, different media within their work. What it leads out from is a discussion about the specialisation of that particular medium itself. This is something that Rosalind Krauss talks a lot about in terms of the notion of media specificity as being pivotal importance in terms of forging some kind of dialectical sort of thinking around that particular medium, rather than fetishising it, and you know, to the point that, you know, one cannot move outside of that. If you move outside of that, you better hop it into a different department. You probably won't have it. You know, that sort of level of debate. Thankfully, you know, I've worked in art schools where there has been that space to actually do that, so that if a student is working in a sculpture department that is making work which would be better perhaps explored, you know, using kind of paint media, print media material, then fine. That's the responsibility of the tutor.
Can I just refer to Stephen in this, because I one of the things I think that's good about having pathways, if not, not material pathways necessarily, or even, you know, traditionally defined practical pathways, is that the idea of having a pathway structure allows you to respond to practices that are being marginalised in your student body, and to put them centre stage and give them resources. Stephen's running now the XD pathway, which is particularly to do with external working, not just site-specific things and socially immersed practice, but the whole idea of exteriority. And sorry, Stephen, I'm still speaking for you.
What do I have to add to all that's been said? I would say that I have a problem with the idea of talking about change as if we're comparing then with now. What I would say is that we're in a process of change, and this process of change has been going on for probably at least since the Second World War, and will continue to go on. And why is that the case? Because, in my opinion, there is no really consensus or understanding as to what art's function is, or we want it to be, in our society, unlike, say, a time when the Catholic Church would have determined what that relationship should be. So we're in this period which is perhaps problematic and perhaps crisis-driven, but is a terribly interesting period to be working in, and terribly interesting to see how many people want to engage in this activity, how many people even want to come to an event like this. What I would say beyond that, and I think connected to that, is the idea that why does somebody want to come to study art in higher education? If we said the answer to that is that all those people want to be practitioners, they want to be artists with a name, with a gallery, with some kind of practice that is recognised in the world, then we would say that we are all guilty of falling short. We're failures because we know that only a tiny proportion of the people who come through our institutions are able to achieve that. However, I would say that that is not how you gauge the value of the activity, and it's not actually the answer as to why people want to study art at this level. And that's another very interesting question to kind of explore. And in this crisis, if it is a crisis which is an ongoing one over decades at least, that is one of the questions that I think we want to explore.
I was just thinking, can you say that as a question? What am I talking about? No. If you were to phrase that as a single question, how would you ask it?
What does somebody want if they study fine art at degree level? What do they want to achieve?
Or what should we be encouraging them to achieve?
And your question, where does the education happen?
That's what's
you
going on.
You don't. Sorry, Sarah. You know that you use the word education, you know, rather than any other word, which is a little bit wider than.
It does raise a question, though, with this now, you know, moving on to the horror that's going to come with the new fees. Certainly for fine art, my opinion is that fine art, of all the subjects we teach at art schools, is going to be the one that suffers most. I'm wondering I think that's what's going to happen. And I just get that feeling, certainly that's coming from the government as well. Not only are we going to have to say what kind of contact hours we give to the students, we're going to have to deliver that soon, but what kind of job is available at the end, and we're going to have to give figures increasingly year by year of where our students have gone into jobs. So with that in mind, and with moving to this culture of the customer, the student is now the customer, they're there to learn a skill to find a job at the end of it. This is the directive from the government. This is supposedly how we started to think. If this permeates our student applications, where students aren't going to go to art school for the reasons my generation went, which was to actually, it was a defiant act. I went to art school to get out of the fucking class system of this of this country, to be different. I didn't go to university. I wanted to be an art student. So if we're getting away from that, and it's more about, and it was about a lifestyle choice. It was something very deliberate. And I still see that as what a fine art student is in one way. So somebody who is making art because art is what challenges the status quo. So if we're now delivering a fine art program in order to come up with a job at the end of it, we're going to be in trouble. And so this idea of the customer becomes very problematic. I see at open days, when students have increasingly over the last few years since they've been paying fees, where parents, much to the poor students, cringing while the parent asking him, what kind of job is there at the end of this? And we go into, well, you know, only 2% of you will make a living out of as being an artist. Then to go on to describe what an incredible, the best kind of education you can have is to become a fine artist. To learn independent, self-motivation, total creativity and way of thinking, be able to make decisions. What better grounding can you have in order to go on for the rest of your life? Business schools are asking for that. They need people who can think for themselves, think creatively. So I don't know what I'm saying anymore.
What is it about?
What kind of package are we delivering? You know, and what? Sorry, it's prompting me, Joe.
So,
Okay.
So I was just going to say that isn't that our responsibility as educators to really fight that corner? I mean, the idea of employability is quite a frightening one from the outside, but
just say no.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're starting to talk about it in our university now as problem-solving courses. I mean, we still call it fine art in our school, but I think there's an argument that we need to develop that will really counter that whole employability.
But we need creativity, we need these kind of people. It's not just about getting jobs at the end, and I do say back to what, you know, this question at Open Day about what jobs guaranteed at the end of it. Would you ask that if little Jimmy was doing geography? You know, that...
Well, that's quite right. I mean, in a way, that's the question about what all the things you've described, which we are all defending in terms of the particularity of fine art education, things that one learns. Surely those are the transferable skills that make students so employable in terms of what, you know, whether you describe that in terms of the ability to think outside the box, you know, to think creatively, to kind of problem solve, etc., etc. Those are highly valuable in commodity terms.
Yeah.
And that's what we really have to defend.
I think that's right. In terms
and people aren't going to do this anymore. I mean, I really think people are not going to choose fine art anymore because of that. You know, they're not going to put £27,000 just for the fees into that. They want a job at the end of it. I'm wondering the terrible impact that they're now going to do graphics or fashion or textiles or whatever, where it is more geared towards a career at the end of it, a placement, and now the pressures from the institution back to the institution and of job placements, you know, that we're going to have to put give students the experience in job placements while they're doing fine art. You know, that's always been problematic on fine art. Links with industry are problematic. We don't have that kind of following briefs and relation to the actual job that the student is expecting at the end of it. So I think there's a dilemma from fine art that's going to...
I think that's a big problem for postgraduate courses in fine art, probably rather more than undergraduate courses, because I think that postgrad courses, the students are already finding it very difficult to finance their way through postgrad, so there's a bigger gap between them graduating from undergraduate and going into postgrad. They often have to try and work off some of their debt. But there was a student at a recent conference I was at who graduated from Birmingham Polytechnic, Birmingham University, a couple of years ago, and she actually asked the question, why go at all? Why should I, as a young artist, go and do a master's course at $9,000 a year? Because the only thing that I would get at the end of that I couldn't get better by spending the $9,000 on getting together with a group of 10 students and 10 colleagues, getting a studio space, inviting and paying people to come and see us doing some exhibitions, is the only thing that wouldn't be achievable is the actual MA. And what's the purpose of the MA in terms of getting a job, because it's not going to help me get a job. So there was a certain pragmatic cynicism about doing a postgraduate qualification at all, because what it should be about is the sort of networking and developing a kind of relationship with tutors, other artists in your contemporaries and outside, and then developing this sort of discourse that can take you into professional practice. The MA per se is not actually that important. It's only this kind of networking that you achieve within that that's important. And I think students are starting to think, well, you know, 10 people, £90,000, you can get a very nice studio set up.
And most of them do their MAs for networking. I mean, that's the... Why would you do an... you know, I agree with you. I mean, I did it... you know, I now actually run a net... Because I'm in charge of the MAs as well as the BAs now. I mean, but I was cynical about... You know, with my own daughter, I didn't fund her through an MA. I funded her through her first 3 years of practice. Much more effective. I agree with you. But I mean, that's because, you know, she grew up in London and Paris. If you'd grown up in sort of, you know, somewhere else that wasn't London and Paris, you might need to come and in order to start your networking. And I think that's one of the main functions of MAs, isn't it? You know.
But there's been a massive expansion of MAs over the last 10 or 15 years, and I think we might experience a bit of a reduction in them.
Yes, that's going to change.
Some of our students who've left the CAS a couple of years ago have actually done that. They've set up together and got their own studios, and that's what they're doing. And then they'll say, well, think about an MA and if it's appropriate and actually helps. But going back to professional practice, because our cohort of our students are older than the majority of BA students that go straight from school, they're very aware of what's going to happen to them when they leave. They want to know how to fill out forms or grants and meet people and galleries and what to do. It's a really important area, that professional practice, and how what are you going to do when you leave? How can you survive? I mean, you can survive on conceit for at least a year, and then where else do you go with that? So there is a kind of thing where I think students, it has to be demystified what it is and how you live and how you work after that degree. And I think that's an important part of our education.
I'm just going to pull it back a bit because we've skirted all the way over to like
topic
4.
Come on.
It's
a bit of discipline.
It's like
Sarah, get at it. Come on.
We're just working out where we got to and where we went to. I think I'm going to pull it back into. It kind of links, but I'm going to put it back to topic 3. I really want to ask a question with one of the main formats in UK art education being the crit. And with, as you said, so much emphasis on networking and peer review and less emphasis on like instruction and taught skills. is art a subject that can be taught, or, as to quote the title of the day, where in art education is the education? I don't know who wants to answer. Who should I throw that one to? Anyone volunteering?
So, can art be taught? Well, I think learning spaces can be created, is what I would say. And what I mean by that is physical space, but also collective psychological space. And I think that is part of the job of a good course, is to create that kind of situation where a forum can occur and people feel, capable of making experiments, making a fool of themselves if necessary, and it all being okay. I think the other questions around are, what are you going to teach? So one of the ongoing questions that I've been aware of, and probably everybody here has been aware of, is how you relate the teaching of art practice to theory, art history, and what it is, cultural studies, what it is that is going to contribute towards that educational process. What kind of body of knowledge is it that students want to learn? And again, I would say that we're in a process of change. This problem has not been resolved and put to rest for once and for all. It will continue to be debated, and I think so it should be. And perhaps, if I was to wave my magic wand, I would dictate that every place teaching fine art in the United Kingdom approach this subject in a different way, so that students then out there, if they were suitably informed about, what was on offer in every institution and every course in the country, could really make a fantastically informed choice. Yes, I want an art course that's informed by 20th century art history. Yes, I want an art course that is informed by reference to anthropology, or any of the other things that you could think of that might be relevant and might drive the education forward.
I would just say that I'd qualify your statement that skills are no longer taught, or are less taught now than they were. I'd say that that we're increasing our skills teaching all the time. All sorts of skills. I mean, we're just putting back a huge printmaking area. The way in which our event teaching works is to bring together technicians and academic members of staff with students, so that the kind of transfer of skills is embedded in crits and everything else. And that we and also when we talk about these professional skills, that we are actually at that moment teaching skills. Very often we find ourselves, don't we, bringing in the young person who knows better than we do what's going on in South London, to make sure that we're not relying on our own skill in making connections. We are actually getting the right person to do that. It's our job to become aware of everything that can be taught and to teach it.
But do you think also if it's being taught, say, in a true sense of the atelier system, you've got staff in...
Can you just explain what the atelier system is?
Well, it's in the studio. The students from year 1, 2 and 3 are taught together. They'll be in a member of staff will be giving tutorials when there's other students around, and they'll be listening, and so there'll be a complete involvement. So that's what the atelier system is, and also students will start listening to staff talking and listening to other students talking, because really I think where art is taught is in the studio. It's where students start talking to each other, as well as having a conversation with the member of staff as well. So, and then when they go away, I mean, in a way, it's what we do is set really good structures where students can then become ambitious and for themselves. And I think in a way, if we lay down good structures, that ambition then comes from the students, or they're allowed to actually.
Yeah, the key skill that we teach is autodidactism, or autodidactism. The key skill that you need the student to have, the artist to have, is the skill to be able to teach herself forever. And,
and those are primarily, I would say, to put forward the skills of being critical and analytical skills. They are skills as much as mixing paint on how to use stretch of canvas. So, and they're primary skills, I would say. How can we do anything with that, which has to be learned, it has to be demonstrated, it has to be encouraged, have that critical, analytical approach. For themselves as well as others, that kind of engagement.
But they have to learn mimetically as well. I mean, I think that's the when we talked about making sure our studios are efficient, you know, that we use studio space efficiently to set up these situations. You know, that there's this kind of mimesis, that's so important to teaching. In the atelier system, the fact that it's an artist in there, you know, that the artist is speaking from their own practice and their own research, and that the students are in a sense mimicking that practice to some extent. That's crucial, I think, still in art schools.
Sort of, where you've got
can I just bring
just one member of staff, so there's conversation.
Oh yes,
between
Can I just bring John in?
Yeah, I was quite fascinated by the question, both when you raised it in the original interviews and also now. And I think, I agree with Stephen's point that really what teaching is about is creating an environment in which learning can take place. But I think the question itself, can art be taught? And obviously it's not the first time I think that any of us have encountered this. It points to a fear. It points to a fear that arises from the mystification of art. And also, as Stephen said earlier, about the way in which the role of art in contemporary society and previous society it isn't clearly defined. It's not, you know, art is not fully utilised or instrumentalised in the way that other forms of creative practice perhaps are. So I think in one sense it's that worry that there's something essential to the art object, if you like, which remains fugitive, which remains beyond understanding. And I think that's true. I mean, in one sense, in terms of one's interpretation, you know, this is the object petit a, as it were, the thing that but the key point there is to think back about the way that the successes, say, for example, of conceptualism and other moments in the past has been to effectively invert that, to stop thinking about the idea of finding the answer within some kind of essential character of the thing itself, and to think about the context in which that thing arises. So the idea of understanding why you know, we might be interested or attracted to something becomes as important as the idea. And the idea that the answer to that question of why we're interested in something lies in the inherent nature of that object, as opposed to our feelings about it, is a key moment of inversion. So I think in some ways, I said somewhere in the interview, and I'm sure the colleagues have felt the same way, it's not the idea. People sometimes say, you know, how can you possibly judge that a red painting is better than a blue painting? Or, you know, how can you say that is worth this, whereas that's not worth that? The key question always is about how the students worked, how the students learning, how the students understood and demonstrated that understanding, demonstrated that appreciation. That becomes the key aspect. And in that sense, art can be taught if it's based upon the premises which, for example, Stephen has said, which is that it is about creating an environment in which the learning and developmental processes can be observed and can be described and evaluated. But it's interesting in a way that I suspect often the idea can art be taught is a question. I mean, I'm not criticising you for raising it, but it is linked to a kind of quite a utilitarian agenda. And it's a link to the idea that there are some things which are practical and useful, and there are other things which are not. And if you can't put a name to it, then it's probably not worth having. And the precise point about art is, of course, that it is worth having, partly because we cannot put a name to it.
Yes, it's not a question that comes up in France. I mean, you know, it is. No, it is. I wonder why that is. It's the difference between. You're quite right. You know, in utilitarianism, it's a difference between a culture which is based on empiricism and a culture based on critique. You know, it makes the difference. And because we're in this empirical culture in Britain, still we ask the question, cannot be taught.
What I was going to say is a lot of you talked about the value of that an art education can provide for everyone, Mo, you mentioned it just now, and as a good overall or general education, and I suppose, but then the paradox is that art courses can only assess for artists or for an artwork being made. I suppose what I'm asking for is there more potential in an art course to train people into other types of, could anyone do an art course, is I suppose what I'm getting at, rather than, is it am I not articulating this well?
I mean, can art be anything?
Can art be, it's, I knew I should have thought this question out before I asked it.
Don't worry, go on. We like to see
Innate
you
genius
think.
you're talking about.
No, not at all. Because art courses are so broad in what they allow people to do, experiment with, become, and then they can then go off and do anything. With that in mind, then, I suppose one is why would it be possible for art courses to be able to assess for that anything rather than just the production of art practice? And the second one is, couldn't art education be opened up for anyone potentially to enter into, as opposed to just people who want to become an artist?
It is already.
Well, it depends very much on your definition of art, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And what's everyone? I mean, everyone with a portfolio that's acceptable. Or everyone, just anybody who turns up on the day.
I think there is something to admit maybe, which might be a bit awful. I think there is a thing with teaching where I do say at some moments, actually this person really cannot think like an artist. I do think there are moments when there are students, sorry, no many names, where you do think, actually it's impossible with this. Because occasionally there are students who really, they cannot think like an artist. I think we might all know what we mean by that.
Exactly.
But there's just something that just doesn't, I don't know what to say about that, but maybe that's something that you're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare, but I think there are some times that it
I mean, I could have a go at answering the question very directly. First one about is it possible to assess these things completely discreetly from assessing art? And the answer is, well, no, because we assess these things through the vehicle of making art. And you assess, if you do a degree to become a doctor, you learn fantastic communication skills, ability to understand, all those kind of things, but they are done through the vehicle of medicine. It's kind of the same with us. We mustn't belittle what we do and turn it into a totally abstract kind of educational thing. I'm incredibly interested in education and in educating, but I'm also equally interested in art. We can't can't see those two things discreetly at all.
I think there's a big difference in art education, and I remember as a student myself feeling that I never really learnt anything from the people that were teaching me, and the people I learnt the most from were my fellow students. And I think that refers back to Stephen's point about this situation that you're trying to create, and that's a situation for students to talk to other students about art. And I think that's a big distinction between art education and other forms of education.
And I think that's terribly important in terms of professional practice as well, to take up the point here, because it's not sort of conceit that gets you through your first year or your first 10 years. It's being able to work with other people, particularly in your peer group. And so you're actually teaching the social practice of art in setting up those moments and those environments.
I didn't mean conceit in. I mean,
no, I know
you live off that kind of confidence of
being young. Yeah, I know what you mean. I remember it.
I think art schools can be very transformative. Somebody may think they want to do art when they come in, but the process of doing art actually turns them into something else. I think that's throughout history that's been the case. I love the case of, just to use one example from the Slade, the beginning of the 20th century, there was an Irish debutante, Constance Gore Booth, who came to the Slade to do painting. And then when she left, she ended up being an Irish revolutionary leader and the first woman MP. So I think, never touched art again in her life. So I think there's a lot of examples like that of all our institutions, G.K. Chesterton, Eileen Gray, studied fine art but ended up doing furniture design and architecture. I think it's one of those places that enables people, I think, to actually think outside of where other people see the discipline lying, so they can develop a kind of creative approach to things which isn't dependent, to go back to my initial point, on the procedure and the degree they're getting. It's about an education. And I think, in a sense, my initial point was that we shouldn't forefront the notion of what we get as an academic reward. We should be focusing on what reward you get from the practice of doing the process of moving towards a professional career as an artist or whatever. But, I mean, British culture is littered with people who didn't necessarily do terribly well at art school, but have done fantastically well in the creative industries. And I think that's to be the music business, the film, well, I suppose that's but it's, it's a very dynamic situation an art school creates. I do, to a certain extent, take issue. I think there are a lot of people at art schools now that really might be better off not being at art school. I think partially that's to do with the huge expansion of numbers.
Yeah.
That I think it sucks people in that I think to a certain extent are disadvantaged. They're not getting out of it what I think they thought they would get out of it, and they're paying a lot of money for the privilege of not getting out of it what they thought they were going to get out of it. And I think that's more to do with the institutions needing bums on seats rather than necessarily the interest of the individual students.
But John, don't you mean that generally about higher education?
I do, yes.
Not just...
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of people getting sucked in to higher education where they would be better served not going into it. And I think it's a shame because I think, and that's partially specialisation again, I think there may be some courses that aren't quite so specialised that they would get a general, well, at UCL is actually bringing one in now, sort of more a general studies degree, more in the
Just on that point, I think one of the things is that I don't think it's about specialisation. I think it is about, for example, decimation of HND courses, for example. And I think there's been a sort of, for example, in terms of certain skills, if you were not interested in pursuing something at an academic level, say in terms of contextual studies, a BA honours kind of demands by virtue of its structure, you could have done an HND in, say, photography or whatever, and got those skills in order to get a place in industry and develop accordingly. And I think that's the problem in a way. Inevitably, once degrees became the only game in town in terms of developing a set of craft skills, as it were, HNDs and so on started to suffer. And I think that's the shame, really.
I must say, just going back to what was said earlier, that I sent out an email to lots of students who'd left the college a year ago and a bit further, and asked what were they doing now. And it actually sort of came back lots of stories, what they were up to. But actually, I was amazed that the majority of the students, even if it wasn't sort of showing or international, all were sort of getting involved in the arts, be it teaching or volunteering or doing whatever. But the majority was still connected with the arts, and I thought that was quite uplifting.
Yeah. Andrew, did you want to say something? And
Well,
then
just following on slightly in a way, sort of John was saying, in terms of what he's described in terms of HND, but it's also, I suppose, this could be extended also in terms of the kind of question of decline or the ending of polytechnic education, in terms of everybody having to go along that far more utilitarian model, really, of means end justification. Really, I think that's something which has been massively deleterious to education in general, as far in terms of this notion of people, as John was saying, who perhaps would be better served not doing a degree. They might be doing something else which is perhaps more vocationally focused and so on. And in a way, that's why a lot of the pressure is now resting on undergraduate department, art departments in general within universities to actually conform to that model.